I'd like to bring up your idea of sex as symbol. You have this idea that we should focus more on being rather than doing when understanding what it means to be a man or a woman. I don't know that I would draw the distinctions that distinction as sort of sharply as you do, but nonetheless, it is a really important distinction to make, and it's the fundamental thing. It is important to get the sort of like the priority right in conceptualizing it, and that the priority is on being. So we've talked about the biological aspect of it a bit, and that's important. But what do you mean when you say that we should see, from a Catholic theological perspective, that we should see sex primarily in terms of symbol?
Yeah, so it's this idea of looking at sex from the perspective of sacramentality, right? Because from a Catholic perspective, a theological perspective, the whole visible world exists. It has its primary meaning in a way is how it points toward higher divine realities, right? So God reveals himself through what he creates. And the most profound way that he's revealed himself through creation is in the creation of the human person, and specifically the sexually differentiated human person. And this is really clear when you look at the Genesis creation narratives, and in Genesis 1 and then Genesis 2 and 3. In each of these narratives, although they're different in fun ways, in each of these narratives, the culmination of God's creative work is creating not just the human being, but the human being as male and female, right? That's the moment where the text breaks out into verse. You could just even see it on the page.
Right.
So there's something very important about sexual difference that it's not only important because that's how the species continues. I mean, that's important. But it's also important because that continuation of the species, that life-giving nature of capacity of sexual difference, is also even more meaningful because it points toward God. It's an image of God himself as this Trinitarian interpersonal communion that is life-giving. So maleness and femaleness and that capacity to create life is this image of the Trinity in a really profound way. And you also have these metaphors throughout church history of humankind as feminine. So humankind as the bride, and
the soul as feminine,
and the soul
as well,
as feminine
in relation to God.
Right. And then God as father, God primarily as masculine. We do have some feminine imagery for God, right? So again, these are metaphors that are meaningful and they're not meant to be taken literally. But what those do is they draw out this symbolic meaning in our potential that we've been talking about, which is, the human potential to receive divine life and to bear fruit with that, right? So that's why the church is also depicted as feminine.
Right.
So those metaphors of femininity and masculinity are deeply important because they're rooted in bodily realities, but then they show how these bodily realities point toward very deep spiritual truths.
Yeah. And this idea of woman as sort of like the quintessential like creature, representing like human creatureliness. This is something that G.C. Dilsaver, who you would probably disagree with on a lot of things, but he talks about that in his book, The 3 Marks of Manhood, quite a bit. And it's a fascinating idea, this idea that on the one hand, you could if man is representing God in this sort of symbolic equation, or in Ephesians 5, Christ and the church, man and woman, you could take that in a direction that could be misleading about, well, men are closer to God, or things like that. But this idea that the woman sort of represents what we all are, is sort of like being most purely like human in a sense, because it represents the human condition in relation to God specifically. And there's sort of like a simplicity there that's very beautiful. So I'm not sure where I'm going with that, but but it's just it's a wonderful thing to reflect on.
Well, it would also, you're right, it would be an overstatement to push the metaphor too far, to make some kind of declaration that, like men are more godlike than women, right? That's just a misunderstanding of what a metaphor is.
Right.
And the metaphor specifically is related to generation. And that's the thing that, you mentioned, in the book, I talk about how contraception has really changed the way we think about sex, embodiment, maleness, femaleness, because we no longer think in terms of generation. Like generation is not in the front of our cultural imagination. But those metaphors are based on generation. So it's the male generative role that mirrors God's transcendence from his creation, right? So it's not that like, maleness writ large or, in this broad sweeping or, exhaustive way is more divine and women aren't or something. That would just be a misunderstanding.
Yeah, because St. Paul does say things, and I can't give chapter and verse, but he does say things sort of like that almost seem to indicate like man is created in the image of God in a particular way that woman isn't, even though, of course, man and women are both created in the image of God. I think this is probably the way in which that should be understood, right? Like if there is some sense in which that's the case, it is in this sort of this generative, this active role, whereas it's easy for people to misunderstand the word passive. So maybe receptive is the better word
it's
for it, right?
Definitely not
Women in this receptive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a very active, it's a very active receptivity, right? Like,
right. If you're going to use the word passive, it has to be understood in like a very particular philosophical sense, because otherwise it can be very easily misleading. But even then, I don't think it works appealing.
Because even in that philosophical sense, it was often based on a misunderstanding of women's role in procreation as not actually contributing a seed as well. So, Aristotle was working in this like single seed theory. So he's and this is very common in the Middle Ages too, that it was the men who provide the seed and then the woman is just kind of this receptive soil. So, the idea of the double seed theory. So there's still this receptivity there, right? But it's also active. There's an activity to it.